evening. My name is Scott Gregory, and I was, what's the word I want? Recruited by Phil to be the program chair for the next year. But Phil, you didn't tell me I was going to have to stand up in front of a big group like this. And I'm not prepared. Now, I figure the reason we've got so many people here tonight is because COVID is beginning to wane. Now, I read somewhere that during the Middle Ages, they celebrated the end of the plague with wine and orgies. And I'm wondering if anybody is making plans for the end of COVID. Now, when Phil recruited me to do this, he said, you know, it's really no big deal. You call an embassy, you ask for somebody to come speak. He said, now and then you run into a little bit of a problem. Sometimes they don't answer. So I called an embassy last week and I get the recorded message. And the recorded message says, your call is important to us. Please stay on the line until it is no longer important to you. So, Phil, you have to give me the true story. Now, we reached out to the Swedish embassy, and unfortunately, that was not the response we got. They were very warm and welcoming and helpful, and we are delighted tonight to have somebody from the Swedish embassy. Our guest tonight, our speaker, is Ms. Ingrid Osk. She is the Minister, Counselor, and Deputy Chief of Mission. Now, I'm not into all this protocol stuff, so I don't know that I understand it all, but let me give you a little bit of her background. She started in this business back in 1999. And I'm going to read a few things because I don't understand it all. She held positions at the Foreign Minister's Office, the African Department, and is head of Consular Affairs at the Department of Consular Affairs and Civil Law. Well, I'm impressed already. Between 2001 and 2005, she was posted to the political section of the Embassy of Sweden in Pretoria, South Africa. From 2005 to 2010, she served as political counselor at the Embassy of Sweden in Washington, D.C. That's where she learned to speak American. Prior to the current position, she served as political advisor to the Supreme Commander of the Swedish Armed Forces. And in September of 2019, she assumed her current position as Minister Counselor and Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Sweden in Washington, D.C. She holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in political science and languages from the Uppsala University of Sweden. Now, if you were listening closely, you heard that she had political section, political counselor, political advisor, political science, and I'm wondering, in this day and age, in the United States of America, in this political climate, how does she explain what's going on in the United States political environment to the people back home in Stockholm? Now let me introduce you to the real Ingrid Osk, because you know all the technical stuff. She is a lovely young lady. I've had the privilege of talking with her this evening in the city next to her. She's married, she's got a couple of daughters. She has a real life outside of all this falderall. She sings in a chorale in Washington, D.C. called Chorales, I believe that's correct. She comes from a very small town in Sweden. She couldn't even tell me the name of it, or if she did, I couldn't remember it. But it is famous because that's where the grandparents of, am I get it right, grandparents of Mamie Eisenhower came from. So she's really important stuff. She's a delightful person, and I'm delighted to present to you Ms. Ingrid Osk.
Thank Scott. I think that was the most colorful introduction I've ever heard. Very powerful. You know all about me, and I think it's such a privilege and a wonderful, wonderful event. Wonderful to be here tonight with so many of you. I feel really humbled. I have met already, talked to so many of you. I've heard your stories, many of you with Swedish background or connection and links, and well, around the table, a few very interesting examples of that. And it's just wonderful that so many of you have turned up tonight. Oh, sorry. Yeah, now I know. I get so enthusiastic, so I kind of move away from it, but I have to work on my mic technique. So it's a great honor for me to be here. I bring greetings from my ambassador, Karin Olofsdotter. She's still on leave. We've had quite an intense summer, as you might have seen in the media. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But she's soon to return. And I'm here tonight together with my colleague, David Lindqvist, who is our brand new press counselor at the embassy. And I hope that we will have a good interactive moment also tonight, where you will ask plenty of questions, and I'm sure if I can't answer them, David can answer them. So we will work in tandem during the Q&A session. Yes, you have chosen Sweden, Swedish-US relations, and there is of course a lot to talk about, and we are working, our job in Washington DC as an embassy is to take care of the bilateral relation between Sweden and the United States, which is very strong and very broad. It's a big embassy. We have colleagues from different ministries, different agencies, and we do work on national security policy, defense cooperation, cultural cooperation, research, innovation, green transition issues, trade, of course, climate-related matters, and so much more. So it's hard to pick just a few areas. I could speak for hours, I guess, but I will not do that. But I will choose a few of these topics and address them a little bit more in detail, and then you're welcome to ask questions about really everything. And I know that you know quite a lot about Sweden already, because I've seen the nice papers that you have, pamphlets on your tables with basic information about Sweden. So you know quite a lot about our country already. Well, what I'd like to talk about tonight, and I'll address it fairly briefly to give you the chance to ask questions also. I'll talk a little bit about national security. Many of those of you who, with whom I've spoken tonight are of course interested in what's happening right now given the situation in Europe and our decision to apply for membership in NATO, which is really quite mind-boggling, the journey that we've gone through this past 6 months, really. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'll also address the economic links that we have between Sweden and the United States that are very, very strong for such a relatively small country like Sweden. I'll talk a little bit about green innovation as well. That's an important area that we work on a lot. And I will end with gender issues, the feminist foreign policy that we are pursuing in Sweden. But feel free to also ask about other things. So, I'll start with NATO. I think we'll have the next slide. I can't really see the slide from here. Yeah. So, what happened earlier this year, to strike a little bit more of a very serious note, 24th of February, was a shock to all of the world, but also to Sweden. And after Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine that happened on the 24th, that was a brutal attack on a democratic and sovereign nation. The Swedish government made a historic decision on May 16th to apply for membership in NATO. And thereby we actually ended 200 years of military non-alignment. And it's interesting when you ask people what they know about Sweden, you get different kinds of replies. Some people talk about ABBA, IKEA, or other things. But many people actually mention neutrality, Swedish neutrality, as one of the first things that comes to mind. We haven't been a neutral nation for quite a while. We abandoned definition of ourselves when we joined the European Union in 1995. Since then we've been just labeling ourselves as a militarily non-aligned country. But what happened when Russia decided to attack Ukraine was that, well, I think it's fair to say it was really a shift of the national security architecture, national security landscape in Europe. It affected us, it affected our Finnish colleagues, I'd say, almost even more, because they've been through wars. It wasn't 200 years that they had a war. They fought the Soviets, as you know, much more recently than that. And this is an existential issue for people along the border. Both our countries concluded after a relatively short period of time that joining NATO would serve our own interests in the best way. And we are extremely happy, I really have to say this, and this is where our intensive summer comes in, about the level of support that we've received from the United States, the extremely quick ratification process, the strong bipartisan support. You talked about the American political landscape, Scott, and I'm kind of happy that I don't have to address that here. That is what I sent home in cables to my capital. But this was actually an issue that yielded very strong support from both sides of the aisle. And as you might have noticed, when there was a vote in the Senate by mid-July or end of July, there was a resounding support, 95 votes in favor of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And the decision was made just the following week by the President to sign the ratification. As of today, 24 countries, or 80% of the alliance, have actually ratified our application. We still wait for a few of them. And we're hopeful it won't take too much time, because of course it's still a very, how should I say, peculiar, very sensitive situation in Europe, and very, very difficult situation in Europe, with still a full-scale war going on, not too far from our borders. Actually, in normal times, when you don't have flight restrictions, it takes less time to fly from Stockholm to Kiev than to fly from Stockholm to Brussels. So that tells you a little bit about the proximity of Ukraine also to our part of Europe, to Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea region. As a member of NATO, we will be a net contributor to security. We have very highly capable armed forces, highly capable defense industry as well. And we are already very interlinked with the NATO structures. We do military exercises together. We have very strong cooperation, both with our European partners, but also with our NATO partners, and not the least with this country, since a number of years. So we trust and believe that this will be a very seamless membership and process that we have ahead of us. And we think that joining NATO will also help us to deepen this already very strong and robust relationship and cooperation between Sweden and the United States. I mentioned economic ties and trade ties. And this is not something new. Actually, Swedish and American relations go back quite far. We discussed a little bit around the table. Almost 400 years. Swedes, or Swedish settlers, or sailors actually, first set foot on American soil in 1638. Yeah, this is exactly a new slide, very good. Yeah, on the previous slide, I didn't talk about the slide, but you did see our ambassador and the president at the ceremony in the White House, right, on the photo there, just a few weeks ago. It was a fantastic moment when the decision was signed. And you also saw, I should have talked about that, I'm sorry to jump back a little bit in my presentation, but you also saw, I think, a photo of a young female military symbolizing our new and modern and expanding military forces. You know, we have today gender-neutral conscription in Sweden, so we also have a growing number of female in the military. But going back to economic ties and Swedish-American relations, 1638, Swedes set foot in Delaware along the Christina River. The Kalmar ship, maybe some of you have visited, it's not too far from here, I see at least somebody nodding, yes. Which is a replica of the first ship, Swedish ship that came to America in 1638. Sweden was also among the first countries to recognize the United States as an independent nation in 1783. And since then, there has been a constant flow of relations of people crossing the Atlantic. Swedes and Swedish Americans have contributed to this nation's scientific, economic, and cultural life in innumerable ways, really, and there are so many interesting examples of this. You have had Swedish companies on the US market for over 100 years, and I think even more than that. Several really of the most well-known US companies were founded by Swedes, including Walgreens, Nordstrom, Greyhound, we have quite a few of them. Today, Sweden actually is the 15th largest investor country in the United States, which is also fairly amazing because I think we are like number 90 or something in terms of population, with slightly over 10 million people. And we support approximately 370,000 jobs in the United States, with Swedish companies being present in each and every of the 50 states of this country. In Maryland alone, actually, more than approximately 5,000 jobs are supported by Swedish affiliated companies. So we have this kind of statistics for all states in this country. But, and I should say, a lot of those activities is also take place within the next field that I want to address, namely the area of green innovation, green transition. We are committed, and our government is committed to taking a leading role in global efforts to fight climate change. It's really seen as an existential issue in Sweden by everyone. I mean, this is not a politically divisive issue, although there are, of course, nuances in terms of what the different different political parties want to address it. But there is a very strong movement, a very strong support, not the least among the younger generation in Sweden, to tackle this challenge. And I'd say that it's driven by our political leaders, but also by industry, interestingly, and of course by public opinion. The government has set ambitious goals for Sweden, and we aim to be the world's first fossil-free welfare nation and to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045, so relatively soon. It's an ambitious goal. And our experience that we really want to export also and talk to with others is that our example has shown that it is possible to reduce emissions while maintaining economic growth. There is no contradiction there. Since 1990, emissions from Swedish territory have decreased by some 29%, while the economy has grown some 86%. So you can have both those developments in tandem. Business and industries are really doing their part, and I think this is a very interesting part of this whole process that we see. I think we have a new slide here. Yes. I'd like to mention a project that we call Hybrid. I don't know if you've heard about it. If you haven't, you might, maybe you will. It's a joint venture between some very big Swedish companies, SSAB, LKAB, and Vattenfall, energy producers and steel companies and so forth. And it's a groundbreaking effort to reduce CO2 emissions and to decarbonize the steel industry completely, which is very energy consuming. So that would be really a shift when that happens in full. With hybrid technology, SSAB, which is also present here in the US, aims to be the first free steel company in the world to bring fossil-free steel to the market already in 2026. And I'd also like to mention another example. In October last year, Volvo Group launched the world first vehicle made of fossil-free steel from SSAB. And the interesting about all this is, I think that it's driven really by the industry. So there is a momentum where industry has seized the benefits of really advancing this technology and putting it on the market as soon as possible. Another example is the Fossil-Free Sweden initiative, which has encouraged business leaders to set their own goals and to draw up their own roadmaps as to how they will lower their emissions and contribute to achieving the Paris Agreement goals. 450 Swedish companies and other entities have confirmed their commitment to this government initiative, Fossil-Free Sweden, driving the transition to net zero. And many of these companies are actually active on the US market, such as the Volvo Group and also IKEA, Securitas, SCA, Skanska, SKF, and many others. And we really want to work more with the United States on this. And I'd say that this is really one of the core areas that the embassy works on, also to create partnerships, talk to American counterparts here in Washington, but also elsewhere in the country to create these kind of partnerships and to share our lessons learned as we go forward in this process. Last but not least, I'd like to talk a little bit about gender equality. In 2014, yeah, new slides, right, yes. 2014, the Swedish government became the first country in the world to declare itself a feminist government and to adopt a feminist foreign policy. What does that mean, really? Well, the focus of the feminist foreign policy is to increase the 3 R's, as we call it, namely rights, representation, and resources for women and girls around the world. And the whole idea was to make this, to have a holistic approach so that we see everything that we do through this lens of female inclusion and inclusion of women and girls also. And since we did that, quite a few other countries have actually joined us and now call themselves either that they have a feminist foreign policy or a feminist government policy. So we think that we have actually broken some new ground and in a positive way on this. And we didn't just adopt the feminist foreign policy because we believe it's the right thing to do, but our government really strongly believes that gender equality benefits everyone, including boys and men and everyone in our society. We like to point at research that shows that more gender-equal societies enjoy better health and stronger economies and higher security, actually. This is, of course, also part of the welfare model, if you will, of the Swedish society. In Sweden, state and municipalities provide affordable child care, also elderly care, generous and gender-neutral parental leave. This is something that we talk a lot about here and that we get a lot of questions about. I have to tell you, we have 480 days of paid parental leave for each child, out of which 90 days or 3 months are reserved for the other spouse. So you cannot take up all of it. You lose 3 months if the other spouse doesn't take it. As an incentive, of course, also for fathers to take out parental leave and be stay at home for a while with their children. And I really think it has worked. If I look at my own career, I can see that there is a great difference, and I think, David, that you agree. If we look at our ministry, that our colleagues, our male colleagues, they take much longer parental leave now than they did 15 or 20 years ago. And this is not something that is, looked down upon. Rather the contrary, it's really encouraged. And I'd say that if you take less than a couple of months, then that would be almost a bit strange. So I think we have really shifted attitudes in our society, which is of course very important when it comes to these things. And this support framework provides an opportunity for both parents to combine a career with family life. And we think, or we are convinced, that this progress has contributed to Sweden's high level of employment and growth also. In fact, the OECD estimates that increases in female employment account for some 10 to 20% of the overall average annual growth rate in Sweden, and also the other Nordic countries over the past 50 years. I think in the ad that I saw about this event and tonight's presentation, it was also mentioned something broader about Sweden's support systems, and I'd be happy to take any questions about that, but I'd just like to say this, that our model that is sometimes debated and discussed also in this country, not the least in times of elections, it's both a very business-friendly capitalist model. It's also combined with a very strong welfare state. And our experience really shows that, again, there is no contradiction. For instance, if you want to take risks, if you're an innovator, if you want to do something, break new ground, start a new company, you might be more inclined to do that if you know that you don't risk your whole economic future or your children's education, that there is a solid support network that allows you to take risks. And consequently, we have a very high number of innovators, creativity and innovation is rated very, very high in Sweden. So that's something that we like to point at, and something we like to also share with others. Of course, I can't end without mentioning that we have our very, very strong and sometimes fierce political debates also in Sweden. If you're interested in Swedish politics, this is the time to maybe glance a little bit on what's happening right now, because we have elections coming up on Sunday. We have parliamentary elections every 4 years. Well, not only parliamentary, also to the region and municipal level. It's extremely close. We're a multi-party system, and at this point it's impossible to say which coalition, because it will be no doubt be some kind of coalition that will form a government. And at this point it's very hard to say which one. But I'd just like to end by saying that it is still very clear that regardless of coalition and majorities in parliament, the support, for instance, for NATO membership and strong transatlantic cooperation is very solid, and it will remain also after the election on September 11th on Sunday. So by that, I will end. Again, it's been an honor and a privilege to be here, to meet so many of you, and I agree, we're still very thrilled to meet in person and not only on the screen. It feels like a true pleasure to do that, and I'm more than happy to take any questions you might have.